I sometimes feel uncomfortable, but history I can talk about for days. All right. So today we want to talk about the slave trade, a grim topic. I want to talk about its size, its timing, its African beginnings, and the Middle Passage, sort of where it comes from and what it's all about. And the thing that I didn't put on here, but I want to emphasize primarily, is something called war capitalism. Because I think this helps explain a lot of what's going on, not just in Africa, but elsewhere, not just in Southern Africa, but elsewhere. And this war capitalism is, for me, the big theme that helps us understand the slave trade and its relationship to the New World. If you're looking for a big theme that distinguishes me from the textbook, one of them is war capitalism. What war capitalism is, how it works, and how it leads to this destruction, not just of Southern and Western Africa, but also the New World, particularly the North American colonies. The way in which these stories are described in the textbook, there are these different events. To me, they're all part of this big thing called war capitalism. And I want to talk about what that is today. And I'm stealing that term, war capitalism, from a friend of mine, Sven Beckert, who teaches at Harvard University. So let's talk a little bit then about Africa, and I'll conclude by talking a little bit about war capitalism. All right. So one thing that's important to discuss is sugar and its role in all of this, what becomes the African slave trade. It was first written about, the first written description of sugar was in India around 600 AD. And people say that sugar followed the Quran. That is, Islam and sugar emerged and spread west at the same time. Islam as a religion was linked to trading families, Muslim trading families. And sugar was an important article of trade because it hardened into a sugar loaf that could last for years. And it represented concentrated calories, but also could be used to preserve foods and like jams and jellies and things like that. Now, the thing about sugar is that some form of forced labor was always involved in sugar was involved in sugar as it started to move across the Mediterranean from the Persian Gulf between 600. So, for example, there was a slave revolt in Iraq around 850 AD. So we need to talk about sugar because sugar is, in a way, the entrepot or the thing that allows slavery to spread. European Christians discovered sugar in the First Crusade in 1096 when they were laying siege to Tripoli, and it's European Christians start to use this to make this new product called sugar, which required tropical or subtropical regions with lots of irrigation. The process of heating and cooling meant that you have something called a factory, which is called a boiling room. This is grim work. It's ugly work. When what's the name of the book? When Dante describes hell in his kind of famous description of hell, Dante's Inferno, he had visited the island of Crete in the in the Mediterranean, Dante's Inferno, yes, and it was a horrible place. It had been entirely stripped. It had been replaced with sugar cane. It had all of these enslaved workers. It was black most of the time. The sky was black because of the burning of the sugar that took place in this region. And it's pretty clear that his description of hell comes from his own experience looking at this island. He describes it as a place with, dark skies, of people suffering and groaning and things like that. Sugar plantations are just awful places. We're going to talk more about this on Thursday, but One of the things we need to think about or remember is that sugar is the most important crop for understanding what becomes the African slave trade. Roughly half of the people that are brought from West Africa to the New World are initially brought to produce sugar. Okay, now about the slave trade. The slave trade is the biggest migration in the history of the world. At least 10 million Africans come to the Americas between 1570 and 1870 in the holds of slave ships. Proportional to population, this is the largest population migration in world history. And when we think about the New World, we need to think about it as a world of transplanted Africans. Before 1800, African arrivals outnumbered Europeans 6-1. Yes, right. There's irony of something so sweet coming from something so horrible. 10 million. 10 million Africans come to the New World in between 1570 and 1870. Okay. A little under, like 45% or so, come to the Caribbean sugar plantations. 33% go to Portuguese Brazil. Is that here? Yeah. It says 32%. 13% go to Spanish America, and only 400,000 go to British North America. That's 4% of that total migration. That population had increased to 4 million by the abolition in 1863. So for the 400,000 enslaved people that come to British North America become 4 million by 1863. Okay, so the timing of this movement, from 1600 to 1700, only about 2 million arrive. From 1700 to 1800, it's over 7 million. 7.5 million, something like that. The peak is from 1701 to 1810. So that's basically the lifespan of George Washington and his father. That in that short amount of time, just over 100 years, 7 million folks are brought over from Africa to the New World, 7.5. The real action starts in the Caribbean and the Brazil, but every Western European nation participated. To a certain extent, the religious traditions, the religious wars that we talked about previously, the Reformation, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, helps contribute to this because Protestant and Catholic merchants take over the slave trade from each other on the sort of justification that it's basically a war between Protestants and Catholics. It is true that there were both Protestant and Catholic merchants on the west coast of Africa. Okay, so a few things about the beginnings of Africa. Africa was not cut off from the history of Eurasia that I was talking about before. Remember, I was talking about Islam, and I was talking about that wide expanse that connects, that goes all the way from Western Europe to China. Africa was not cut off from this at all. There's no such thing as pre-contact African history. Africa was always part of this world. Africa was part of an Indian Ocean trading system that linked African merchants to Arabia, to India, to Persia, and to China. The West African city of Timbuktu, which you can see here on this map, it's what's now in Mali, was in the 13th century a magnet for Arabic-speaking scholars around the world. Okay, so Africa was not cut off, but that said, this is Islamic Africa. It's Northern Africa that's especially affected by and transformed by Islam between 600 and 1300. Southern and Central Africa, as you see here, there's less contact and there's less connection to this broader world. It's not that they're disconnected, but they're slightly less connected to this Eurasian world. Secondly, so I said, first of all, it's not cut off. Africa is intimately linked to the transformations in the world in this period. Secondly, it's diverse. In East Africa alone, which is where basically think about Ethiopia over here on the east, You have indigenous religions that are replaced by Judaism in the 6th century, and then by Christianity in the 7th and 8th century, and then by Islam in the 9th century. By the 12th century, much of northern Africa and parts of eastern and western Africa followed Islamic traditions. But in central and southern Africa, indigenous religions held sway. Now, partly this is a peculiar fact of the sort of southward currents that work in Africa. Partly it's there are relatively deep rivers, but these swift African currents mean that it's relatively hard for traders to move into this region. There are winds that force you down in this direction very sharply around the Canary Islands and make it very difficult for Europeans or Asians or others to travel to these regions. It's the caravel, remember, that navigable caravel that allows Europeans to get to the New World. It also allows Europeans to get to the coast of southern and western Africa. Okay, so I said, number one, it's not cut off. Number two, it's diverse. There are a lot of different religions in southern Africa that are not touched by Islam or not touched by Christianity. Okay, the third, right, there you've got Coptics in North Africa. That's a great question. That are they're Coptic Christians, basically, who are a kind of religious tradition that's diverges from the Western religious tradition, Western Christian tradition, probably in the 3rd or 4th century, something like that. Okay. Sorry, I can't keep you up. We're talking about the slave trade in Africa, and we're talking about, number one, Africa was not cut off from world history. Number two, it was incredibly diverse. Okay. Number three is the importance of migration and communities. There's a spread of technology and ideas in this area in southern and western Africa. Unlike Europe and Asia, but very much like pre-contact North America, the many parts of Africa were underpopulated until recent times. They were new regions for around a pioneering society. Thus, in many places, land wasn't owned or compartmentalized. This is really important. Land was not owned or compartmentalized. These are people who are moving into back in these regions in Zaire and Angola and places like that we now call these regions. But the control was not through control of land. Control was through the control of people. Okay. Reasons. I'm not sure the reasons. So basically, migration and community. Number one was Africa was not cut off from world history. Number two was diverse. Number three, the importance of migration. So migration is very important, and migration means that people are controlled, not land. That's important because the control of people is what we call slavery, and so slavery is regularly practiced in southern and western Africa. Yeah, and many parts of Africa were underpopulated. So these are settler communities. So for example, just to give one example, the Gold Coast here in, this is the Gold Coast, right? Right around here. The Volta River is this place that produces gold. Many of the people that are along the Volta River have come there in the last, say, 50 or 100 years in, say, 1600. So people had migrated from here into this region in the Volta River. Likewise, in the Congo River, people had moved from the Sahara into this region in the Congo River. So there's a lot of migration and movement, and people are controlled rather than land. Yeah, sure. Remember that I could talk a little bit about the test. Remember that the test is basically comparing my take to the book's take. It's going to be about 300 words, but I will talk about this a little bit more, Jenny, at the end of class. Okay. There was indigenous slavery in southern and western Africa. The term that was most often used is limbry, Limbry. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that there was slavery in southern and Central Africa. So there was slavery in ancient Greece and Rome. There was slavery in the Aztec and Inca empires. There was slavery in Russia. There was slavery in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Slaves in the 1500s and 1600s in Africa were not captured to be enslaved. Sometimes they were prisoners of war. Sometimes they were people convicted of a crime. Sometimes when an extended family owed a debt, they would give out a person in the family, usually a woman, to act as a sort of promise for that debt. So if a family got in debt, a daughter would be given over to another family that owed the debt. This was called pawn slavery. And the daughter would then be reunited if the debt were repaid. So people in Limbri, in this slavery, were neither a part of society nor apart from it. They were suspended in a sort of social limbo. They participated in these communities, but they didn't have many of the rights that other people did. They were marginal society, and the thing about this in southern Africa is that it tended to be hereditary, so that if your mother or father were enslaved and owned by another family, your children were likely to be. Perhaps 80% of African societies had Limbri. Okay, so this is not this is the consensus. It was that African Limbri was a form of institutional marginality where individuals were restricted in their participation in society. Unlike commercial slavery, they were not, on the whole, mistreated, dehumanized, or exploited. Limbry, Limbry. There was, however, of necessity, trade in these marginal people. This was the only way to guarantee that they wouldn't escape back to their own people. This trade was what Europeans tapped into in what I call war capitalism. Okay, so while we tend to be shocked by the existence of slavery, what should strike us is that slavery was incredibly common. And of course, unfreedom was common to the expansion into the New World. Indentured servants, remember, in Virginia and in New England, were bound to a master for a limited period of years. Debt peons, people who owed debts in England were then transported to the New World to pay off those debts, were bound to a creditor until they paid off that debt. Convict laborers who were transported to the colonies would be bound to particular masters as well. Okay, Limbri, yeah. When you add to the 10 or 11 million Africans who survived the crossing, you can't help but be amazed by the proportion of people who came to the New World in bondage. About half of people in the 18th century who came to the New World were bound laborers. Okay, so if you have ancestors who are from the New World, it's very likely that many of them were bound laborers at one point or another. The question should not be why was there slavery or how did slavery change with the discovery of the New World. Not just be why there was slavery, because there was slavery all over the world, but how did slavery change? The answer to how slavery changed is, I want to suggest, what Sven Beckert calls war capitalism. This is basically European warships which seize ancient trade routes and shipping lanes, and then establish trading enclaves on the African coast and in the Americas. They create military encampments that are called plantation. This is armed trade and violent expropriation in the name of trade, what Beckert calls war capitalism. Okay, so this is Elmina Castle in the African Gold Coast in the late 17th century. The places where slaves were picked up were almost invariably on islands just off the coast of Africa or right up at the edge. As you can see here, Elmina Castle is separated from the mainland by this bridge, which makes it sort of impregnable. In Central Africa, Europeans could not generally establish themselves in these regions. Unlike, say, Macau in Malaysia or other parts of China, Europeans couldn't establish themselves. They instead built enclosed forts on islands and then rented land from African kings right up against the coast. These were called castles, and they were designed to defend against rival traders. Okay, so this is there are different African trading regions. There's Senegambia up here. Sierra Leone down here, the Gold Coast, which is here, the Bay de Benin, which is around here, and then the Niger Delta, Congo up here on the Congo River, and then Angola down here. Each of these regions was slightly different, but basically from the Gold Coast to Angola, most of this region, the way that slavery worked was Europeans would marry into African communities, establish themselves on islands, and buy up the enslaved people. Partly, why couldn't they establish themselves? They weren't. Communities would so African communities were organized in areas that basically rejected the arrival of people who wanted to steal land from them. So people had poisoned arrows, they had steel tips. They basically prevented Europeans from settling there. And the way that Europeans figure out how to do this is to set up these armed encampments. This is Fort Nassau, which is in now Ghana, which was a Dutch trading post. Similarly, in Angola, the Portuguese establish a fort, and this is the port in Angola. Okay. And so this is basically using European technology to keep people out and then bring in people who are then going to be traded on the Atlantic and brought to the New World. This is war capitalism. Powerful ships with cannon. Europeans would send stonemasons over to an island and build a fort and then defend it. It happened all over the world, and it was basically armed trade. The Europeans couldn't effectively communicate with the people in Africa. They were rejected by these people, and so what they do is they establish these forts. Now, this is not just true of Africa. This is true all over the world. Okay, so let's take a look at the Portuguese Empire in the 15th century. Okay, this is where Portugal establishes itself. It establishes itself in Macau, just off the coast of China. It establishes itself in Malacca, which is in Malaysia. It establishes itself in Luanda, which is in Angola. It claims these regions, but it's actually just tiny little forts that are right along shipping lanes that they control. The Portuguese claim to control this entire region, but in fact, they just control the area right along the coast. Okay. Whoops. Lanzados. Wrong image. There we go. Yeah, it's useful in trading if you control an entry point or the shipping lanes or things like that. And European ships are useful in this regard. Okay, so how does slavery actually get? What's the nexus? How is it that Europeans are able to tap into the slave trade? Well, they do so by basically intermarrying. So a couple of male European traders will establish themselves in a fort and then marry into African communities. And so the term for this is lançados, the Portuguese term. They're the first ones to do this. These Europeans lived in coastal forts. They married African women to establish commercial ties and family relations. And these women's sons and daughters would learn both European and African languages. It's spelled here, Lanc with a little kind of hat below it, Ados. Basically lancados, yeah, that's good. But in Portuguese, you've got that little schwa, so it's lançados, not lancados, which is what it looks like in Senegambia. They married African women, established commercial ties and family relations. They're a mixed ancestry group, and these were the most important in gathering captives for trading across the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, cast out ones, thrown out ones. And there's a couple of explanations for where lançado comes from. Some is that they're cast out, others is that they desire land. I'm not sure I understand the Portuguese term itself. Okay. So the lançados are the traders. They're the biracial traders who marry African women. They dress differently. Okay. They wear European clothes. They often have crosses around their necks, although they're not particularly Christian. They don't see them. Some of them, or many of them, don't see themselves as Christian. They see themselves as separate. They wear hats, okay, rather than going bareheaded or with, they wear kind of European style pants. They establish castles in these regions that become very wealthy. The actual capturing of enslaved people takes place with Africans themselves. And this is the kind of grim part of this story. The captured Africans were marched for several hundred miles to the coast. These are the Imbangala warriors, which were east of the kingdoms of Congo and Angola. So along the coast, there were these kingdoms. And then the inland, by around 1650 or so, there are these communities that are highly mobile communities. The Imbangala warriors were mostly men. They were adults. They were highly mobile, and they had guns. And they would use the guns to capture people from other communities and then bring them to the coast, where they were traded for guns, for gunpowder and things like that, with the lançados who are on the coast, these biracial people, and then they would be brought over to these new ones. No, they were not. They were separate communities. The Imbangala warriors were separate communities. The Imbangala warriors, if women got pregnant, they left the community. They had the children outside. They raised the children outside. If a child was born in an Imbangala community, it would be killed. The Imbangala warriors would capture boys, usually around the age of 13. They would put a collar around them, which demonstrated that they were enslaved by the Imbangala. Once they had killed someone, then the collar would be removed and they would be brought into the community. Tribes is the wrong word. The Imbangala is basically a kind of mobile state that raids other people and kills other people. Yeah, and you work with the lançados for trade, especially for weapons, and particularly guns. Now, guns are not actually the greatest thing to be used in the Congo River. For example, you get your powder would get dry or something like that. But the guns were a kind of symbol. They also made a loud bang, and the bang itself was in a way just as important as the ability to kill someone with these guns. And these people were the people who brought captives to these regions. So there had been trade in Limbri. There had been enslavement, but it was a sort of informal kind of exclusion from the regular community where you had work to do. These people would be captured by the Imbangala. There were some Imbangala warriors who were women, but it was primarily men. These were somebody said tribes, and this is not. They're not. It's almost like a fraternity of men. The Imbangala in general. It's pretty diverse depending on where you are. But along the Congo River, where these people were captured, this was almost like a fraternity of men who gathered together and raided other communities. They were constantly traveling, constantly moving. Yeah, like modern roaming mercenary or rebel armies today in some African regions. Right. Sorry. Everything's a fraternity. But it's a sort of brotherhood of men that's in particular are the people who are raiding. Okay. So this is starting to sound familiar, right? This community that I've been discussing. This is precisely what's happening in the New World at the same time. Precisely with the same people. In South Carolina, the Goose Creek. So the Imbangala, basically what I'm trying to do is suggest that there are these communities that are shaped by war capitalism. Okay, that's a great question. What's their importance? These are people who communities that are created by war capitalism, who because of these weapons, because of the wealth that's coming from this trade, are distorted and deranged by this society that demands more and more people for the creation of sugar colonies in the Western world. This is war capitalism at its ugliest, right? Is these societies? Other things about Bengala, you can read more if you look them up, but they supposedly would occasionally eat their captives. They didn't have settled communities, and they just tore up these kingdoms throughout southern and central Africa. They just tore them up, destroyed them. So that there were a whole bunch of settled communities and kingdoms in these regions that are basically destroyed by this conflict. That's all about capturing people and bringing them to the West. Now, it's a little, as I said, it's a little different in Senegambia and places like that, because in Senegambia there were African kingdoms and they took only people who were enslaved in other parts of Africa, brought them in, and then traded those people. But here, kind of along the Gold Coast, along the Congo River, the Volta River, the Niger River, there were basically these fraternities that were engaged in raiding other communities to take people away. Okay. I'm not going to comment on fraternities. I'm not suggesting that these are the Fidels or something like that. This is a very different kind of society. Okay, so what does this remind us of? All right, we read about the Yamasee War. We read about the Tuscaroras. This is very similar to what's happening in North America at exactly the same time. Let me tell you about the Goose Creek Men in South Carolina. Okay, the Goose Creek Men was a group of 8 men who were closely connected to Charles II, right? Remember that this is South Carolina is an area that's heavily colonized once Charles returns to the throne. Along with French Huguenots, they used the Catawba, the Yamasee, and the Cherokee to defeat the Tuscaroras. Okay, so the Tuscaroras are a settled community. Tuscaroras represent, some of you are members of the Tuscaroras, so send an emoji if you're a member of the Tuscaroras. All right. Tuscaroras towards the end of the alphabet, I'm forgetting. Okay. Tuscaroras. Okay. So the Tuscaroras were people who were living in these communities in South Carolina, right? Your community is destroyed by the Goose Creek Men, right? The Goose Creek Men hire, effectively, the Catawba, the Yamasee, and the Cherokee to defeat the Tuscaroras. As the Tuscaroras saw it, the Catawba, the Catawba, the Yamasee, and the Cherokees were basically these same things, armed bands of men whose job was to raid settled communities, take slaves from them, and use them in South Carolina. Okay, so the Tuscarora community is very tiny now, in part because of this raiding by the Goose Creek Men. And this is 8 guys, right? This is war capitalism. 8 guys with guns, with access to European markets, who are wanting to produce sugar on plantations, are able to destroy tens of thousands of people by using proxies. And these proxies are the most important thing. 8 men can't destroy the Tuscaroras. 8 men with 1,000 Catawba, Yamasee, and Cherokee can defeat the Tuscaroras, and that's precisely what happens. Okay, so the Tuscaroras rose up against them, but they were killed by, and you'll see this in 123 and 124 in the book, but were killed by the Catawba, the Yamasee, and the Cherokees in what was called the Tuscarora War. Remember, too, the Natchez War, right, which is also in this chapter 4, where the French supported the Choctaws, and the Choctaws were very much like the Imbangala. The Choctaws were a kind of raiding community of mostly men who raided other people for slaves and destroyed those local communities. The thing that's hard to watch is people whose identity becomes wrapped up in using the tools of war capitalism, using the tools of these armed traders. That's the most horrible thing about war capitalism, really, is that it didn't take that many European traders to absolutely destroy settled communities in southern Africa as well as in North America. All right. Why were these people being captured? Why do they create? Why does Europeans help fund and then supply these raiding communities, which then destroy other communities? Well, the answer is for the slave trade. What's called the Middle Passage. The first passage is the long marches from the African interior to coastal ports. And this was often led by warriors like the Imbangalan. The Middle Passage, though, is on the slave ships. So millions died on the first passage, and many more died on the Middle Passage. It's estimated that between 10 and 20% of Africans died on this Middle Passage across the Atlantic. Those who resisted, and there were more than 150 shipboard revolts, usually died. I want to quote from Olaudah Equiano, who was sold into slavery by a conquering kingdom. He eventually bought his freedom from his American enslaver and later published a memoir of his experiences. Okay, oh, sorry, you've lost the caption here. Yeah, this is the Equiano's narrative. I was soon put down under decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and the crying together, I became so sick and low I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon, to my grief, two of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the nads, laid me across the windlass, tied me by my feet, while the other flogged me severely. If I could have gotten over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. The place where they were bound to, for those who survived the Middle Passage, the worst still awaited them. Most Americans live short and brutal lives on sugar plantations of Brazil or the West Indies. Planting and harvesting sugar required intense periods of hard work under a hot subtropical sun. And since sugar prices were high and slave prices were low, many planters simply worked their slaves to death and then imported more. Except in the mainland American colonies, they did not encourage the formation of a workforce of families that would reproduce naturally. They purchased 6 male Africans for every woman, and forced pregnant women to work in the fields. Now, I want to suggest that this is the West African slave trade. There is an African slave trade, bear with me here while I go, that goes all the way back to the 7th and 8th century. So there is a slave trade that takes place sort of with Muslim traders that goes from the west to the east, particularly in this region from the 7th century to the 11th century. This is mostly women that are coming from the west to the east. But this trade that's emerges in between, say, 1600 and 1810 is mostly men who are brought from the east to the west. After 1600, it's both men and women that are being brought from the east to the west. For example, between 1708 and 1735, British sugar planters in Barbados imported about 85,000 African slaves. That's Barbados. But the black population of the island increased from 42,000 to 46,000 in the same period. So Basically, people are captured by these communities. They're brought over by slave traders, and they die in basically after 10 or 20 years of work on these sugar plantations. Barbados imported 85,000, okay, between 1708 and 1835, but the black population went from 42,000 to 46,000 in those 30 years, right? So people are being brought in, but they're dying just as quickly as they're being brought in, just about as quickly as they're being brought in. Okay, so this is war capitalism. Let me talk a little bit about this before I talk about tobacco. To conclude, Africa was always bound to the Eurasian continent, but less so in Africa south of the Sahara. Europeans married into these areas by establishing themselves on coastal or island towns. And right, and Barbados was a hub, right? Barbados was a place where people were brought and then sometimes re-exported. So that's a good point. Sometimes there were people who were there just to be sort of seasoned, was the word they were used, to be brought to the West Coast. Europeans would marry into these African kingdoms. They stay on the coast, and the coast over time becomes more powerful than the interior. So interior communities are increasingly raided by these coastal forts, not by other people, but the coastal forts become very, very powerful in West Africa from this period between 1700 and 1800, or 1600 and 1800. Indigenous religions that were both Islamic and Christian in Africa after 1300 argue that people that are captured from the interior are justified for being slaves. So the Pope in 1300, a papal bull in around 1500 declares that it's possible to enslave people who are neither Christian nor Islamic, and that those people can be enslaved for life. Likewise, Islamic interpreters of the Quran say that it's possible to take people who are neither Christian nor Muslim and enslave them, basically, and their children. So the variety of indigenous religions in southern and western Africa means that it's easier for both Christian and Islamic leaders to justify the capture of these people and the permanent enslavement. It's the purpose of war capitalism. The thing about war capitalism is that it's always about trade, but it's always about commanding those trade routes. And by establishing yourself and locking yourself into an island off the coast of Africa, you're effectively able to control other people. It was both the Pope and it was justified both in by the Pope and in the Quran. In the Quran, it says you can enslave another Muslim, but it doesn't say anything about enslaving a non-Muslim, somebody who does not worship, does not read the Quran. And so that's the justification initially for Islamic folks holding Christian prisoners. It's really around after 1300 or so that increasingly both Muslim and Christian traders are willing to, or both the Muslim and Christian religion justify the enslavement of other people who are neither Christian nor Muslim. Yeah, it's the commodification ultimately of human beings, of turning people. So basically taking these trade networks and using people to populate those trade networks. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a series of papal bulls. That's a great question. Give me a second here. I'll look it up because. Um, Okay, by 1300, the Catholic Church said that you could enslave only infidels who had been taken in a just war. Okay, then in 1452, Pope Nicholas V says that Portuguese can invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. So it's a papal bull in 1452 that says that perpetual slavery is allowed for Saracens, which is basically Muslims, but also pagans and any other unbelievers. That pronouncement was based on the idea that any war against Muslims was an extension of the Crusades and therefore just war. It then takes that justification in the papal bull of 1452 to basically enslave people in southern Western Africa. In another papal bull in 1455 said that Guineamen and other Negroes taken by force and some by barter of non-prohibited articles have been converted to the Catholic faith. The implication of that was that those who were not converted to the Catholic faith could be perpetually enslaved. Okay, so yeah, so basically, this sort of indigenous religions mean that both Islamic. Let me conclude when I talk about war capitalism. Islamic and Christian rulers will argue after 1300 and particularly after 1452 that people captured from the interior are justified for perpetual slavery. Number three is the importance of migration. These pioneering societies that had enslaved people who were a relative minority of the population in a tradition called limbering are weaponized by European societies. That tradition of having a few people who are enslaved in these West African societies, less than something like 10% of the population are enslaved, that this weaponized by war capitalism. That war capitalism takes this internal trade in people who are enslaved and creates, with both the Goose Creek men and with the Imbangala, basically create or contribute to the creation of indigenous societies that will enslave other people. And that's basically all they're doing. That's basically all they're doing in this society. The only way in which they're generating anything, they're not planting crops, they're not engaging in any other trade except trade in human beings. Sorry, this is the U.S. survey to 1877. Welcome, Joa. We're talking about the slave trade, and so war capitalism then is this sort of weaponizing of people and a trade in people, and turning it into this society that produces sugar. Okay. So some differences between the Caribbean plantations and the American South. The Caribbean was more important to Europeans than the American South was. The American South was seen as a place, mostly as a place the American South was seen as a place basically to feed the Caribbean. North American slavery, though, is changed ultimately by the tobacco system. And I want to talk a little bit about tobacco since we have about still 25 minutes. Okay, so somebody asked me for if I would, when I change topics, that I go to another thing. So we've talked about war capitalism. We've talked about the weaponization of people. We've talked about an internal migration of enslaved people that's turned into the African slave trade. The African slave trade ultimately sucking 10 million Africans from Africa to the New World between basically 1600 and 1810. Okay, transition. Here is the sign for transition. And I want to talk now about tobacco because initially it's all about sugar, but I want to talk a little bit about how tobacco changes this. Okay. The region that extends from eastern Virginia up the Chesapeake after 1625 is the area that's dominated by the tobacco system. And this is a string of tobacco farms up to Maryland and Delaware. I've got an image here of the Caribbean. Okay, so it's this area here. So there's Delaware. So sort of Biden land all the way down to Richmond. This whole area is the best place to grow tobacco. And they take up West India. There is native tobacco, which is very harsh, but there's a sweet tobacco that's taken from the Caribbean that's transported into this region. A West Indian tobacco strain that's perfected to make a kind of sweet tobacco. And there's a string of these tobacco farms. Now, I say farms because these are not large plantations. These are small farms with anywhere from 10 to 30 people. The tobacco is grown on small plots based on the labor available. One person could grow about 3 acres of tobacco and 3 acres of corn. And so if you had 10 people, you could grow 30 acres of tobacco and 30 acres of corn. Even large landholders grew tobacco on a small piece of land. So a large landowner might own 200 acres, but only grow tobacco on about 10 or 15 acres. There was a mixture of servants and slaves in the 1600s. This was this is the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake is this area that's basically from Delaware all the way to Williamsburg. This area here, the Chesapeake. People in the Williamsburg would object. But so this is the Chesapeake up here, and this is the Tidewater. So it's basically the Chesapeake and the Tidewater. Okay, Sophia. So Chesapeake and the Tidewater is the places where tobacco is grown. So let's look at the process. You can see the process in this picture here. I'm going to zoom it in a little bit. You start by planting, and that's what's happening here. With seedlings. All the way here. They plant the seedlings in a closed area covered with glass, a greenhouse. And then you transplant them to this region over here, where they're then, you take out the worms, you sucker them. Sucker them is taking out the branches. You top them by cutting off the tops so they grow wide rather than up. And strip them and cure them for the harvest in the fall. And the harvest in the fall takes place here. The tobacco is harvested and hung up in these barns. This tobacco production is initially done with indentured servants, but is increasingly done with enslaved Africans after 1700. Okay, and so that tobacco barn is where this is turned into tobacco. There was a scattered headrights system after 1616 where people, so some people were brought over as indentured laborers. Many of those who were brought over as indentured laborers were given land. Charles the first created a headrights system so that people could settle where they wanted. This is a current map. This is Surrey up here, just to give you a sense of the craziness of the settlement in Virginia and Maryland and places like this. There were no squares here at all. This drove Thomas Jefferson crazy. This is why there were more lawyers in Virginia than anywhere else in the world. It's incredibly disorganized, and people were always fighting over where their land was. There was a system called meets and bounds. I'll type it. METES and bounds. It's a medieval system where you had to travel around a region every year and shout out loud that this was your area. You put rocks at the edges of the land, and you called out the meets and bounds every year to prove where your land was. Lawyers were then constantly fighting over who had this land. So this is what it looks like right now in or about 5 years ago in Southern Virginia. Often neighbors would be separated by acres of forest, and people would claim land that they thought was good for growing tobacco. So by comparison, this is Harrison, New York. This is where I have more, sorry, more ancestor stories. My seventh great grandfather, the John Nelson who married his wife was Native American. She was Mohegan, and the Mohegan Indians sold Harrison's Purchase in 1650 and 1652, I think, and all of this land was given to them. And this is a New York, New England settlement where basically everything is squares, and this is Virginia settlement. So Virginia and Tidewater, Chesapeake settlement. To sell tobacco, you had to be close to water. The method for curing tobacco was adapted from Native Americans, and it was cured in small barn and rolled into these things, which are hogsheads. And mostly they weren't covered with some of... there's a hogshead. Okay, that's what a hogshead looks like. It was about 500 pounds. And it was rolled up into these hogsheads of about 500 pounds where it would roll down to the water where it was ready to be sold. You could die if you were hit by one of these hogsheads. There was one person who was crushed by a hogshead in 1652 where it rolled down. He lost control of it. He was trying to push it from above, and it rolled over and basically broke all of his bones. Okay, the importance of the hogshead is that it kept them dry, but there was something called the teredo worm. I'll spell it. The teredo worm that basically infected or got inside the barrels, and the teredo worms would then eat their way out of the barrels over time. And so what you needed to do was dry and seal up the hogsheads and hope to sell the tobacco before the teredo worm devoured it. And so that meant that the thing had to be sold quickly. So ships would ply the water of the Chesapeake and subsidiary rivers and take on tobacco. Let's go back up to this region here. And if you look here, so you've got Williamsburg here, you've got the York and the James River, you've got these other rivers, and these rivers were the places where trade took place. A supercargo was an officer on a merchant ship who is in charge of commercial concerns. So let's see I think I've got an image of a supercargo here. Okay, so what we have here is the enslaver here, and this is the supercargo. And the supercargo is the person who's making an offer for these hogsheads. Okay, the supercargo would stop off and take on cargo, basically with sails. Sometimes, if there were, they would be carried up, like the James River and some of the rivers that weren't easily navigable. They'd be pulled up with ropes and things like that. But some of them, the James River and the York River, are wide enough that you can actually sail back and forth on them just with the sail. They don't look that wide from this massive map, but the James and the York River, for example, and these other rivers are wide enough that it's possible to sail up and down them. So who is here? English merchants, and we'll talk about a little bit about the Navigation Acts, but also sneaking in are the Dutch merchants who don't have to pay a tax, and the Dutch merchants who are going to buy this land. So the supercargo would stop off and take on cargo and offer goods for sale, the ships that came from London, Bristol, or Glasgow, or occasionally from Amsterdam. Okay, so let me talk about some results then of tobacco and how tobacco shapes the landscape in the Upper South. There are 4 results of this form of agriculture. Number 1 is there's little urbanization. There's no need to travel to a central town to get provisions because provisions come from the rivers. So the waterways are the highways. That means there are not really cities in the Chesapeake. There aren't big cities at all. Richmond is a tiny enclave. Williamsburg is a tiny enclave. Just a few, 1,000 people or fewer in these regions. There's almost no urbanization. All the settlement is willy-nilly in these communities where people settle where they think they can grow the best tobacco. Number two, so little urbanization. Number two, is difficult to control this region because it's illegal under British law to sell to anybody but a British trader, but Dutch traders who kind of happen to be there could trade illegally with these folks. So it's very difficult to control these regions. Very difficult for the English to effectively demand taxes and things like that from these tobacco regions. Third, and this is the most important, is relations of dependence are established between the large planters who have first indentured servants and then enslaved Africans and small planters. The supercargoes only stop off at the large planters' locations for the hogshead because of the teredo worm. Because if a trader stopped at 30 places, there's very likely that the teredo worm would eat it up. And so a supercargo would arrive, would want to go to the largest planters, buy, say, 30 or 40 hogsheads, and then skedaddle back across the Atlantic with that. That meant that even though the tobacco was grown all over the place, large planters were increasingly the most important and powerful people in these regions. The wealthiest families in Virginia made their money not just from the plantations, but also from the commercial relations with their neighbors. They cultivated relations of dependence with them. These are the FFVs. You've heard that expression, FFVs, First Families of Virginia. The First Families of Virginia are the largest planters who had established themselves at the best locations along the rivers for trade. Planters followed the best tobacco land along the rivers, but the few plantations, and large plantations, controlled these others. And this is another feature of war capitalism. So war capitalism is a plantation system. War capitalism is where you have at the tallest part of the region in which you controlled, in which an enslaver controlled perhaps 30 or 40 Africans. This person would be at the top. This would basically be a castle. This would basically be an armed place. This would be where the rice would be stored. This would be where other food and provisions would be stored, and possible to basically control these enslaved people who are in the quarter below them. They also, though, have stores, and this is the store here on the edge. And the store is the place where other people come to buy and sell goods. So small planters, people who use just family labor, or people who had maybe one or two indentured servants, one or two slaves, would come to these stores and they would trade, bring in, say, one or two hogsheads of tobacco and get other goods like salts and dishware and forks and things like that, other things that could be produced in Europe. The cultural feature of the Chesapeake was it basically, this is a society of lawyers, gamblers, and drinkers. What did I say? Little urbanization, difficult to control, relations of dependence. Oh, the power of the wealthiest families. So the wealthiest families are the most in control. And these were called the FFVs, the First Families of Virginia. The First Families of Virginia: Carters, Burwells, Randolphs, Pages, Nelsons, Braxtons, Fitzhughs, Withs, Washington, and Lee. I'm actually not descended from those Nelsons. We were the white trash Nelsons, but the Nelsons are one of these families. So those names: Carter, Burwell, Randolph, Page, Nelson, Braxton, Fitzhugh, With, Washington, and Lee, were often roundly disliked by their neighbors, but they were the most powerful people in those regions. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "A Randolph, a Carter, or a Burwell must have great personal superiority over a common competitor to be elected." But the powerful families of Virginia did, in fact, control Virginia, controlled Delaware, controlled Maryland. The powerful families clustered around the governor. He had a royal commission, and he combined the executive, judicial, and military in one function. So, white people who were not descended from these, an early American aristocracy. Most white people were overseers, teamsters. Teamsters are people who basically drove the cars. They operated back and forth with these ships. This is a ship with hogsheads of tobacco that's being carried to a store. These are teamsters that are basically truckers who move out west. Poor whites remove themselves to the rivers. Many are overseers. Others work in garrisons, forts, scout boats, and trading boats. Okay. While many poor and middling whites farmed, the largest planters were necessary to anybody who farmed. Imagine a harsh winter, right? You're out of fruit, and you know that without those things, you're in danger of getting scurvy. You're forced to buy provisions at the little crossroads stores that some wealthy planter neighbors had established. Right here. You might have to sign over a lot of your next year's tobacco to get the supplies you need to keep your family alive. Okay, so this is the birth of 7-Eleven, right? 7-Eleven is owned by the Southland Corporation. Stores are basically how society is organized in the Upper South. These little stores, which charge you way too much for gum and way too much for milk and way too much for everything, are the sort of inheritance of this tobacco system that's established in Virginia. This is where 7-Elevens come from, but they're owned by the largest families. So if you look at any map of Virginia or look at any map of Maryland, most of the places that are towns are called something like Jackson's Stores or Washington Stores, because it's where the store is that you buy goods from others. Okay, if you're a small planter, you sign over a lot of next year's tobacco to get supplies, to get fruit. It's also where you go if you want to plow, a new plow, or you want a plow point, or you want clothing, or things like this. Supplies to keep your family alive. You'll be thankful you can get the fruit in the winter, but you'll resent him, that planter, when he sends someone over to collect your tobacco at harvest time. So it's this society where the largest planters have the most control. By comparison, and pushing back against this society then, in Virginia society, are the Baptists. The Baptists are more radical. The Baptists are the Western farmers. The Baptists are the folks in the middle part of Virginia who oppose the Anglicans, who are effectively control the church and the university. The College of William and Mary, it's founded in 1693, and it's basically where the Anglican gentry go. So that's another result of this. But the most important result is the way in which African society changes. Most African and African American men who work in colonial Virginia work in sex-segregated barracks. And many work on relatively small plantations because it's impossible there aren't really large tobacco plantations. There aren't tobacco plantations that produce more than, say, 100 hogsheads or 50 hogsheads of tobacco. So many work on relatively small plantations. Thus, conjugal relations, that is, sex and then having children between men and women in the Chesapeake, are among plantations, and this is called abroad marriages. So for many Africans who are from these regions in Virginia, what we see is a much more kind of Afro-American cultural traditions. Many more children are raised by their mothers and other women in extended networks, but men can only travel on Saturday and sometimes on Sunday to their wives in these other regions. And so what we see is children raised in these extended networks, largely in the slave quarters. Because tobacco was more of a branded product than a specialty product, it was much more direct interest in and control of the production process. So on those hogsheads, the other reason the first families of Virginia are named is because the name of the family is going to be on the tobacco itself. And so this is a kind of branded product that comes in these regions, and these planter families are effectively more or less masters of tobacco and sweet tobacco. White people picked up figures of speech and language from enslaved people and vice versa. But Virginians were mostly understandable to people in other regions of the country. So the Virginia accent is one that's a Southern accent, but it sounds like more like an English accent, right? In fact, I knew somebody when I went to UNC. I met this woman, African American woman, who spoke in what I thought was a fake British accent. But it turned out that she was from Tidewater, Virginia, and had grown up in this family that had this. So that kind of fake Virginia accent, sort of fake English accent, is associated with Virginia in part because there's less of an there is an African inflection in this language, but it's less pronounced than in a place like South Carolina. It also meant that there was very little independent slave economy. In 1695, Virginia outlawed slave-owned pigs and declared that any pigs with slaves' marks on them would be sold to the parish. Planters tried to take over all food production from slaves and issue rations as a form of control. As early as 1650, on these plantations, the births of slaves are more than the deaths. And it's in this region that we're going to see enslaved people carry on and outlive the plantation, outlive this tradition of war capitalism. So what is war capitalism? War capitalism is capitalism, but with guns, basically. It's taking over existing ancient and medieval trading patterns with powerful sailing ships, powerful guns, and then using those to break up African societies and Native American societies to establish this new kind of military institution, which is called the plantation, on those very same regions. Those military-style plantations are going to be the kind of central feature of what we call war capitalism. But war capitalism is also this this coastal slave trade where these Western European folks will establish these trading networks and take people and transport them to this other region. Africans are intentionally mixed with other Africans from other parts of the region so they can't talk with one another, so they can't plan insurrection. It's a desire, an attempt to destroy African cultural traditions in the creation of this new military-style institution called the plantation. Are there questions? Okay, about the exam is going to be 300-word answer to a question, and it'll be a question that asks you to compare my take on something with the reading's take on something. Yeah, it's a new term, a relatively new term. It comes out of Sven Beckert's book, Empire of Cotton. Best way to prepare is, I think, to look over so I find the textbook to be, wandering a little bit. So I would take a look at the big themes, the big questions that I've asked. How does the Protestant Reformation change Europe? How does it change the Americas? What is war capitalism and how is it different? How does it change African society? How does it change Caribbean society?